My husband trapped me with my high school ex. I'm still reeling from everything that happened. As I write this confession, I feel a mix of embarrassment, regret, and disbelief. How did I allow my insecurities and doubts to spiral so far out of control? My name is Anna, and I'm 35 years old. I've been married to my husband, Mark, for 10 years, and until recently, I thought we had a strong, loving relationship. But it turns out that everything I believed was built on a shaky foundation. This is the story of how I let my past ruin my present, my marriage, and ultimately my life. Mark and I met at a mutual friend's engagement party when I was 23 and he was 26. I was fresh out of college, eager to dive into the adult world, and still navigating my career in marketing. Mark was confident and charming, with a promising job in corporate finance that had him well on his way to climbing the corporate ladder. He had this magnetic presence that made everyone gravitate toward him. I was instantly drawn to him, and we hit it off right away. Our relationship progressed quickly. Within a year, we moved in together. It felt natural, and I was thrilled to have him by my side. I thought I had found my partner for life, someone who understood my ambitions and dreams. Mark proposed 2 years later in the cozy little restaurant where we had our first date. It was a simple affair, but it was perfect. Surrounded by our closest friends and family, I felt like the happiest woman in the world. We had a small wedding, just the way I wanted it. We exchanged vows in front of family and friends who supported us. After the wedding, we settled into our first home, a charming 2-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. I was excited to build a life with him, but little did I know that our journey together would soon be filled with challenges. For the first few years, life was wonderful. We traveled, went on spontaneous weekend getaways, and supported each other in our careers. I remember a trip to Italy that we took for our second anniversary. We wandered the streets of Rome hand in hand, soaking up the culture and history. It was magical, and I believed that we could weather any storm together. But as Mark advanced in his career, things started to change. He began working longer hours, often staying late at the office or traveling for work. I understood that this was part of his job, but as weeks turned into months, I began to feel increasingly neglected. I had my own job in marketing, which kept me busy, but the void left by Mark's absence was becoming more palpable. Our conversations started to dwindle. The light-hearted banter we once had turned into logistical discussions about schedules and chores. I felt like we were becoming roommates instead of partners. I tried to talk to him about my feelings, but he would always brush me off, saying he was just stressed from work and that things would get better. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I began to doubt our relationship. As Mark continued to climb the corporate ladder, the pressure on him only intensified. He often came home exhausted and irritable, and his late nights became more frequent. I started to feel like I was living with a stranger. The intimacy we once shared seemed like a distant memory. I desperately tried to rekindle the spark, planning romantic dinners, weekend trips, and even surprising him with little notes of affection, but nothing seemed to work. One night, after a particularly long day at work, Mark came home late, and I confronted him about his lack of attention. I had been feeling insecure and lonely, and I wanted to understand why he was withdrawing. Instead of addressing my concerns, he snapped at me, telling me he was doing his best and that I needed to be more understanding. I was crushed. That confrontation marked a turning point in our relationship. I felt unheard, unappreciated, and alone. The idea that he might be cheating on me began to take root in my mind. I started imagining scenarios where he was with someone else, and the more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. One evening, in the midst of my doubts and insecurities, I received a Facebook message from David, my high school boyfriend. David and I dated for a brief time during our senior year, and although it was a teenage romance, it had left a lasting impression on me. We broke up amicably when we went our separate ways for college, and after that, life took us in different directions. Seeing his name pop up on my screen brought a wave of nostalgia. I hesitated before opening the message, but curiosity got the better of me. David reached out to catch up, telling me he had recently gone through a divorce and was back in town for work. I was surprised but excited to hear from him, and I quickly replied. We started chatting frequently, reminiscing about old memories and sharing updates about our lives. David was charming and attentive, and as I shared my struggles with Mark, he was a fantastic listener. It felt good to talk to someone who was genuinely interested in what I had to say. He was encouraging and supportive, often reminding me of my worth and potential. The attention he gave me was intoxicating, and I began to see him as a source of validation. As our conversations deepened, I found myself confiding in David about my frustrations in my marriage. I told him about the growing distance between Mark and me, how I felt ignored, and how lonely I had become. He offered me advice, telling me I deserved to be happy and that I should never settle for less than I wanted in life. I felt understood, seen, and desired, something I hadn't felt in a long time. After weeks of messaging back and forth, David suggested that we meet in person. He was going to be in town for a work conference, and he wanted to catch up over coffee. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to be unfaithful, but the thrill of seeing him again pulled me in. I convinced myself that it was harmless, just two old friends reconnecting. So, I agreed to meet him. When we finally saw each other face to face, it felt surreal. The chemistry between us was undeniable, and I could feel the butterflies in my stomach like I did back in high school. We talked for hours, catching up on everything we had missed. He made me laugh, and it felt like no time had passed at all. As the conversation flowed, I found myself drawn to him. The way he looked at me, the way he listened, it reminded me of how things used to be with Mark. It was exhilarating, and I couldn't help but think about how I longed for that kind of connection again. On our second meeting, we decided to go for drinks. The atmosphere was electric, the cocktails were flowing, and laughter filled the air. As the night progressed, the alcohol took hold, and I felt a wave of courage wash over me. I flirted with him, teasing him like I hadn't done in years. When our eyes locked, the tension was palpable, and without thinking, we leaned in for a kiss. In that moment, everything else faded away. I kissed him, and the world outside vanished. We ended up back at his hotel, and in a whirlwind of passion, I cheated on my husband. It felt wrong, but it also felt thrilling. I justified it to myself by thinking that Mark was probably cheating on me, too. In my mind, this was my chance to reclaim control over my life. Afterward, I felt a mix of exhilaration and guilt. I didn't regret what had happened with David, but the nagging feeling of betrayal loomed over me like a storm cloud. I knew I had crossed a line, and while part of me wanted to come clean to Mark, I didn't know how to face him. Instead, I chose to bury my feelings and continue seeing David, convinced I could keep my double life under control. For weeks, I continued to see David behind Mark's back. We would meet up whenever Mark was working late, and I thought I was being clever. I would spend hours planning excuses to cover my tracks, but the thrill of my secret kept me going. David became my escape from reality, and every time we met, it felt like I was stepping into a new life, one where I was desired and appreciated. During this time, I began to withdraw from Mark emotionally. I would come home late from work or make plans with friends, leaving him in the dark about my whereabouts. I could sense that he was becoming more worried, but I was too caught up in my affair to care. But unbeknownst to me, Mark had already caught on to my behavior. He noticed the changes in me, the late nights, and the new patterns in our relationship. Instead of confronting me, he chose to observe quietly. Little did I know that he was gathering evidence and working with someone from my past. As I continued my affair with David, what I didn't realize was that Mark had reached out to him. David was not just an old flame, he had become a pawn in a game that Mark had devised. Mark had known about my growing insecurities and my conversations with David. Instead of confronting me directly, he set up this elaborate plan to test my loyalty. Mark hired a private investigator to gather information about my meetings with David. This investigator, Ben, happened to be an old friend of Mark's from college. They had kept in touch over the years, and when Mark confided in him about my behavior, Ben jumped at the chance to help his friend. Ben approached David under the guise of an old buddy and started to befriend him. He learned about our meetings and the emotional support David was providing me. Mark believed that if I had a genuine emotional connection with David, it would expose my true feelings for him and prove that I wasn't the loyal partner I claimed to be. The whole situation was like a twisted reality show, and I was blissfully unaware that I was being set up. One fateful evening, Mark decided it was time to confront me. He invited our family over for dinner, claiming he wanted to celebrate our marriage. I thought it was a sweet gesture, but the tension in the air was palpable. As we sat around the dining table, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a few courses of polite conversation, Mark cleared his throat and caught everyone's attention. My heart raced as he spoke, his tone growing more serious. He revealed that he had something important to share with all of us. He then proceeded to pull out his phone and showed the gathered family the evidence he had collected. He played a recording of my conversations with David and displayed pictures of us together, moments that I thought were private. My cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and I could feel the heat rising in my chest. I glanced around the table and saw the shocked expressions on my family's faces. "Anna, I had to find out the truth," Mark said, his voice steady but laced with pain. "You've betrayed our marriage, and it's time everyone knew." The room fell silent. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and utterly ashamed. I stammered, trying to explain myself, but the words felt empty. I was caught in my lies, and there was no way to justify my actions. The shock of the moment hung in the air like a thick fog. Mark continued, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I set this up to see if you'd choose me or him. I wanted you to realize what you were risking." In that moment, I realized that the man I thought I could manipulate had turned the tables on me. I was faced with the devastating reality of my choices. My heart sank as I looked at my family, who had come to celebrate, now forced to witness my downfall. After the dinner, everything changed. I felt utterly humiliated, and Mark didn't want to speak to me. I had broken the trust between us, and the damage felt irreparable. My family, once supportive, looked at me with disappointment and hurt. They had never expected this from me, and I could see the sadness in their eyes. In the days that followed, I faced the fallout from my actions. I lost friends, family support, and the one person I truly loved. Mark and I moved through the house like strangers, and the silence was deafening. We had once shared dreams, hopes, and laughter, but now all that was left was an empty shell of what once was. I reached out to David, desperate for some comfort, but he quickly distanced himself from me. He had no interest in being involved in my messy life, and I couldn't blame him. I felt abandoned and alone, realizing that I had risked everything for a fleeting moment of excitement. Now, as I reflect on everything that happened, I've learned some hard lessons about trust, loyalty, and the dangers of letting my insecurities drive my decisions. I let the distance in my marriage cloud my judgment, and I allowed my desire for validation to lead me down a path of betrayal. It's been a painful journey, but I'm working on rebuilding my life. I don't know what the future holds for me, but I do know that I need to be better for myself and better for anyone I choose to let into my life moving forward. I thought I was clever, but in the end, I was just a pawn in a game I didn't even realize I was playing. As I write this confession, I can't help but feel a mixture of regret and hope. Regret for the pain I caused to those I loved, but hope that I can grow from this experience. I'm seeking therapy to address my insecurities and work through my feelings of inadequacy. I've learned that my worth doesn't come from others but from within. I hope that by sharing my story, others can learn from my mistakes. Cheating isn't just about the physical act, it's about the emotional betrayal that can tear apart relationships. It's so easy to get lost in the fantasy of what might have been instead of facing the reality of the life we've built. I let my old flame cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I lost everything that truly mattered. I'm determined to become a better person, one who values loyalty, communication, and love. I'll carry the lessons I've learned with me as I navigate my journey ahead.